What was I going to say? Okay, I'll just give a little bit of a disclaimer. This Gemara is not particularly intimate, but it is. If you're drinking coffee, you might have a little bit of not exactly the most appetizing Gemara. I'd say. So if you have if anyone has difficulties and
we'll look it over during breakfast.
Can't handle it, that's absolutely fine. Okay, basically the subject is various let's call it substances that exit a dead body. And that's most of the discussion for today and tomorrow. If it's too much for anyone, feel free to log off. I get it. Okay. Okay, so we saw a bunch of definitions of how a Nazir, different types of tumah that a Nazir is prohibited. In general, a body obviously is the whole body is his body corpse. We spoke about previously in the Gemara what happens if the body wasn't shalom. A kohen is allowed to become tumah to his parents. What happens if his parents' body isn't complete? So Gemara came out that he could become tumah, but it was sort of a debate. Now we go to a Nazir. A Nazir is prohibited to become tumah to a dead body or to any form of fraction, however you cut it, including what's called kazayas notzel. What exactly is notzel? Akazayas meis, akazayas notzel. But ezehu notzel. What exactly is notzel? Basar hameis shekarash. It's one of two things. Either it's flesh of the body that's been sort of dissolved and then it's congealed, or it's umuel shehertiach. Or so sorry for getting this specific. Basically, liquid that exits a deceased body, let's say from the mouth or sort of sweat, any other fluids. If they're not fluids that are coming from the breakdown of the flesh, they do not have tumah. What's called kicha v'niyah is saliva. Saliva that is not tumah. It's only mu'ah would be something like. 1 second. Let's say the some amount of the flesh broke down or fat broke down and turned into a liquid. That liquid would be called mu'ah, and that would have tumah. That would give tumah, and the Nazir can't become tumah to it. So the Gemara wants to know, hey chidami, when you have this mu'ah shertiach, you have some sort of fat that became into a liquid. It was heated and it became into a liquid. Hey chidami, what's the scenario? We don't know necessarily that it belongs to the body, to the deceased. Maybe it's something else. So the Gemara says, Kikarish Mahavo. I'm sorry. Okay, the taste is a little bit different. In other words, we don't know whether we have sort of congealed liquid next to the body, and we don't know whether it is from the flesh or fat that broke down into a liquid. And sort of started oozing out. It also could be that the heat that was applied was higher heat. It wasn't just whatever the heat in the room was. Or maybe it was saliva or some other liquid that isn't tummy. So if we don't know, then what's the difference if it congealed? And if you do know that this is a result because let's say the deceased body was out in the hot sun with black clothing and it was getting really hot, so you know that this is sort of flesh or fat that was breaking down. If that's the case, then even if it's not congealed, even if it's not a liquid, it should also be even if it didn't stiffen up to congeal into a solid, it should still be tummy. Rav Yirmiyah taught this time. We're talking about liquid that you find next to a dead body. Ikarash, if it's congealed, mulhu. Loikarash lo kicha v'niyah. If it's congealed, so then it makes sense. Sort of, it's the liquid that comes from a breakdown of the flesh or the fat. But if it's not congealed, then you presume it's sort of saliva. Okay. Abaye had the following question from Rabba. Yesh notzel behema or ein notzel behema. Okay, so what does this mean? We have a concept that an animal that was killed, a kosher animal was killed, is called a nevela. Right? The Jew is not allowed to eat nevela. Nevela means an unslaughtered animal. that animal also creates tumah, impurity. And the question is, what exactly happens with that impurity? What sort of status would you give it? So let's say you have this liquid that oozes out of an animal. Obviously, Nazir is allowed to become tummy to an animal, but if you have this notzel, which again is either the fat, either the flesh that broke down or fat that broke down, is that considered the same as the animal? In other words, we say by dead person, we say that notzel is like the dead person. John, I just see you logged on. It's a little bit of a graphic gomorrah in terms of we're discussing exactly the categories of flesh that a dead person that a Nazir prohibited to become tummy to. So if anyone can't handle the specifics, feel free to log off. Okay. Again, so the question is, we said notzel, which we said was the flesh that broke down or the fat that broke down, does that rule apply also to an animal? Okay. So now the Gemara tries to sort of break that down. Forgive the pun over there. Okay, as follows. So I guess the best example to this is sort of as an introduction. Let's say we'll use kosher food, right? So one of the things that we know is that if kosher food becomes inedible, it's eina ro'i leger. Non-kosher food that becomes inedible can now be used. It loses its status as non-kosher food. So for example, So for example, there are certain rabbis. I spoke about this when I spoke about bad hechsherim, but one of the common denominators with really bad hechsherim certification agencies is they will certify gelatin that comes from a non-kosher animal. This is public knowledge. You can go search on Amazon kosher gelatin. You'll find plenty of places selling beef bovine gelatin from a non-kosher animal, and they're selling it as kosher. What's their reasoning? They argue as follows. They say that because it reaches, in order to make gelatin, you basically have to pulverize the bones at I think it's 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit or hotter. So it basically turns into an ash. And then you sort of blend the ash with some other things, and you get is basically just the collagen and nothing else there. So they say you're eating ash. What about the fact that the ash can make anything into a beautiful shape? Make Jello float, and it can make all sorts of candies and cake look very nice. And obviously it's edible, despite the fact that it's ash. They say first it became ash, then it's completely nullified, and now afterwards, it's now that you reconstituted it, it's still considered no longer edible. This general reasoning is not typically, most people would not consider this to be a valid reasoning, because ultimately the ash never became nullified. It's always edible. Now it might not be edible in sort of pure form, but it's always suitable to be used in food to, get any gelatin, it makes things stand. Okay, so now the question is with regard to nevela. Does nevela, when we say the nevela has tumah, the nevela has to be edible. What does it mean it has to be edible? Does it have to be edible for a human being, or does it have to be edible for a dog? I'm not a dog owner, but from what I understand, it seems quite clear that dogs are willing to take any type of meat, even the meat that's not fit for human consumption. So now, obviously, notzel is clearly something that's not fit for human consumption. No, obviously, non-Jews eat nevela all the time. There's nothing wrong with that. You shoot an animal in the heads and you take the meat. It's not complicated. But with regard to, but you have this animal that's sitting in the hot sun and starting to break down, and all of a sudden liquid starts oozing out from it. Not exactly an edible product, but presumably a dog would lap it up in a moment. So the question would only be relevant if we say the definition of tumah would be specific to an item that's edible for a dog. Because the whole idea, notzel is certainly an item that's only edible to a dog. A human would not eat notzel. Okay. So the Gemara says this question: if whether an animal, the tumah of notzel applies to behema, is hanichal amanda amar tumah chamura ad leger v'tumah kala ad lekalav shaper. If you say that the tumah of nevela extends only to that's edible by a ger, by a non-Jew, the tumah kala, but with regard to so we have tumah chamura means a nevela. Nevela creates tumah. You had an animal which can't become tummy because it's alive. Then you shot it with a bullet, with a what do they call it, a bolt gun, right? And you killed it, and now it's tummy. You created tumah. Let's say on the other hand, for example, you have a person who becomes tummy mace. Okay, he's an avatumah, and he goes around and starts eating food, or he touches food. That food he makes into a rishon tumah. Maybe technically we can get into a sheni, shlishi, and possibly a revi even. We'll learn about it in Masechtas Saita. That's called tumah kala. That second type of tumah where I made something tummy, that thing isn't a source of tumah, it's something that became tummy. So everyone agrees that when something becomes tummy, it only loses its tumah status once it becomes invalid for consumption, even by a dog. But this first opinion says that tumah chamura, when you're creating tumah, that's with nevela, you need to it needs to be edible specifically for a non-Jew. It has to be edible, fit for human consumption. So if that makes sense, so according to this first opinion, there's no question here. Nutzel is not a relevant category because nutzel is not fit for human consumption, so therefore it isn't tummy. Whether or not the concept of nutzel doesn't even have to exist as a concept because it's not edible, it's not tummy. Period. However, Elamand Amar Tumah Chamura Ad Lekelev, according to the opinion that says that Tumah Chamura, meaning the Tumah of Nevela, is Ad Lekelev, goes to the point of fit for consumption of a dog. Ma'ik Lameimar, so then the Gemara, it's not really Ma'ik Lameimar, it's sort of, then we have a question. Do we say nutzel exists or don't we say nutzel exists? Toshma, let's examine this. One second. Okay, so basically, you took fat from a nevela and you melted it under a fire. It's tummy. If you did it b'cham, if you did it in the sun, it's tahar. Okay, now here's a question. If you'll say that so this sort of melting of fat is not so, right? These are the other kelim. If you hold that nevela is tamei, even if it's fit for consumption only for a dog, safilu b'chamanami, even if it melts in the sun, even if you melt the fat in the sun, why is it tahar? It's still edible for a dog. So the Gemara says, so therefore this should prove that even if you say that the tumah exists when it's only edible for a dog, it's still there is no nutzel to an animal, and that's why if it melts in the sun, it's tahar, because if it melts in the sun, it's nutzel. One second, hold on, 1 second. No. This is sort of 1 second. Hold on. Yeah. If you say there is nutzel to an animal, then why would it be a difference whether it melts in the sun or whether it melts over a fire? In both cases, if you go with the opinion that says that it's edible, even if it's only edible for a dog. So the Gemara says, okay. So the Gemara says, "Emes ma'amchilei." When does it melt? What's the atzrach? After it rots in the sun. In other words, in order for it to melt in the sun, it has to be in the sun for a long enough time that it started to rot. Even the atzrach chavalei offer. And once it starts rotting, then it's considered like dirt, and therefore there's no tumah. Okay, so therefore it's not a question. It could be that nutzel does exist if you hold of the opinion that nevela would be tumah even when it's only edible for a dog. Okay, now we get into a little bit of a side discussion. Nitzek, what is nitzek? So if you let's say you pour water from one cup to another, right? So you have this stream going from the top cup to the bottom cup, right? In certain cases, it's much, much more pronounced. For example, if you're pouring honey, right? Okay. So you stop pouring and it still like a little long, it's like that long drip. Mm-hmm. That long drip is called a rear. as in like backing up, putting the car into the rear gear. It's called rear, reish yud reish. There's another example of this would be, let's say you take a very thick cake batter. So apparently those who cook, they know that when some way to test if the batter is good, you lift it up with a spatula and you see how long it takes to drip, right? So the dripping of the spatula, that's sort of like a rear as well, because it connects. But you can have mixtures like that are just very thick, something like ketchup, maybe. Ketchup sort of stands. It wouldn't be a perfect example. You're looking for something that doesn't stand. But it's very, very thick. So it slowly moves around, but it won't stand on its own. That's called samchi. That's called very thick. You're talking about like a porridge, maybe, or like a farina cereal. Very thick mixture. Okay, now in both of these instances, when you're pouring it from one to another, do we say that? So let's say you have a bottle of honey that's tahar, it's pure, okay, and you're pouring it into a cup that's tummy. Does the cup, the top cup, because it's connected, do we say that that's a chibur or not? And the two points we'll discuss now is rear and samchi. Rear means that you have this long string, like the honey, and samchi means you're using a very thick mixture. So because it's so thick, you're pouring it, it's sort of, do we view it as if it's connected? And therefore the top one will become tummy. So now, kol nitzik tahar, all nitzik is tahar, except for chutz midvash hazifim. This means either honey that's from a town called Zif, or it's honey that's so thick you could throw in impurities and nobody will realize. In other words, the honey's so thick you could blend it with water to thin it out, and nobody realizes you're selling a tainted product. Or it's tzapiches. Tzapiches is, I don't know, I think there's an English term for it, I don't know what it's called. It's like a raw honey type of thing. It's a mixture of honey with wax. The wax from the bee is mixed in. So whatever it is, it's very, very thick, and honey clearly has what's called a rear. It has these long strings. Okay, next side. Beishamai says, "Af hamak v'shal grisin v'shal pull." Also a bowl of porridge. He said, "Ledes la'achara," because it's very, very thick. I think it means sort of when you use a spatula, it sort of stands for a moment before it settles. But how does the article translate the word "ledes la'achara"?
It springs back to the upper container.
Okay.
Is that what?
Yeah. Okay.
One stops pouring it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So some of it comes back up. Okay. So boy, remember the following question: Yesh nitzik la'eichlin, I ain't nitzik la'eichlin. With regard to foodstuffs, does the concept of nitzik exist or not? What's the question? Mi amrina mishum de'isbehu riri v'hani les beriri, adom mishum de'smicha hu v'hocha ha smichin. Is the reason because of riri, meaning because you have these long strings, or is the reason because they're thick? And obviously the question is, with what other foods, when we're trying to figure out if they have the tumah of nitzik, are we going to evaluate them based on the fact that they're smichi, they're very thick, or are we going to say they have to have riri? Riri is that sort of thing like cheese, like you pull up the cheese and like this long drip.
Like mozzarella or something.
Yeah, exactly. Or like honey, it's like very thick,
right.
thick, it's like these long strings. So is it only those categories, or is it anything that's really thick? The Gemara will try to, okay, go in order. Amar Rava. So Rava says, Toshma, let's examine this. Chelav hames shehu shalom. So you have the fat of a human being, and I'm sorry, this is of a nevela. Yeah, I think it's a nevela. 1 second. It's in, 1 second. No, this could very well be from a human being. It's called a mace. It's probably from a human being. So chelav hames, you have the fat of a person. Shehu shalom. It's complete. I guess it's a large piece of fat. Okay. V'hitichai, and somebody was melting it. Tamei. Everything remains tamei. Now, what happened? We're talking about a scenario where he has just one kazayas, a whole kazayas. So kazayas of chelav min ames is tamei. Now that he's melting it, the question is as follows: does it melt in one unit, or does it melt in drips? If it melts in one unit, so then the one kazayas is now exactly, and it never shrunk at any point in time. There's a long Taisus here. This has a number of questions on this, but the point of Taisus is that although it is true that you could combine from, let's say, for example, two mason, two dead people, or they're murdered in a bloody manner, and their blood mixed together, and you pick up one revius of dam. Half the blood is from each person, or even less. It could be 3/4 and a quarter. The din is that blood is tummy. We saw this previously. Revius dam shnei mason is tummy. It's tummy, and revius dam shnei mason is tummy. It's also true that kazayas from shnei mason of basar is also tummy. So if there was some sort of brutal accident and you have a kazayas of flesh from both people, it's also tummy. However, with regard to chelav, it's different. Chelav, it has to be, you can't blend them back together. That's called a chibur adam. In other words, you had two separate units of fat. Each one was a half kazayas. Let's say the next scenario. Hayim before. So you have 5 pieces. Each combined, they make up a kazayas. The ticha, then you melted it, then tahar. Why? Because the liquid that comes out of those 5 pieces is 1 unit now. But who created that 1 unit? A person, right? It's a chibur b'dei adam, right? Sort of just like, what's another example of chibur b'dei adam? Bread, right? Or better example would be like a matzah ball, right? You had a piece of bread, you crushed it into nothing, and then you put it back together, right? That's what a matzah ball is. So for example, there is no isser, there's no prohibition on Shabbos of crushing a matzah ball. Not sure why you would do that, but if you wanted to, there's no prohibition of grinding, because the putting together was b'dei adam. You put it together.
Okay.
You can't. Right, exactly. It's made with matzah meal. You took a ground substance, you put it back together, and now you want to grind it again. There's nothing wrong with that. So the same thing is true. It's not considered a connection. It's not considered a chibur. So therefore, even though you have a volume of 1 kazayas, because you were the one who put it together, therefore it's not considered a chibur. Okay. So now we have a problem here. You're melting a kazayas of flesh. Presumably, what happened? It started dripping out slowly. If you say nitzik is not a chibur ba'oichlin, if you say we don't view it as if it's connected, now again, fat, you sort of have these reary things. 1 second. If you say that there's no concept of nitzik, so therefore when it started to melt, presumably it melted in a few drops first. Once you have a few drops that came off of it, even if they're still connected, but you don't have a kazayas anymore. And if you put it back together, well, that's not a chibur. That's not considered a connection. So you lost your kazayas. So Rav Zera wasn't impressed with this. I know Marbre Ravina Tergamino, me and the son of Ravina, we explained as follows. Basically, the Isakula Gabi Adodi. Basically, what happened was he was melting it in a pan, and sort of it melted in an instant, and it all melted at once in the same corner of the pan. Yeah. So therefore, it was always a kazayas. It was always connected. Okay, Amla Ravina Ravashi. So Ravina says to Ravashi, Toshma, let's try to evaluate this question from another angle. Pouring a cereal because it's very thick. So therefore, Beis Shammai says that there's nitzik. We say that there is a connection. So you see, from Beis Shammai's opinion, the main argument here is the fact that it's thick. So maybe the rabbi's opinion is the same thing. So Gemara says, no, not necessarily. The rabbi's example was a scenario of honey, which has these long strings, and not an example of a thick item, like cereal. So therefore, just because Beis Shammai holds that any thick item becomes tamei because it's thick, there's nitzik because it's thick, doesn't necessarily prove that according to the Rabbanon, that the concept would apply to thick items. It would only apply to things that are like very stringy. Okay. Fine. And now back to the previous discussion. Al mole tarvin rekev, on a measurement of rekev, of fat, of disintegrated flesh. The kamashiyuri, how do you measure that? So Chizki says, mole pis sayad, the measure of the palm. So what is the palm? The palm is sort of the base of the fingers until the arm, right? This is the. Why am I being so specific? What's an obvious statement? We'll get to it in a moment. You'll see why. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan says Meloi Chafna. Meloi Chafna means a handful. What is a handful? Handful is two hands together. This is a handful.
Oh.
Okay, so it's sort of 2 times plus palms, right? A palm is this, and a handful is this. So it's a little more than double that. Okay. Okay, Tanan. The Gemara says, Maloi Tarvid Rekav, Sha'amru, Yeshnan Me'ikar Espisiv Lamala, Divrei Meir. So Meir says that how do you measure a measurement of rotted flesh? It's from the base of the fingers, presumably that means this line over here, until Ulamala, upwards, meaning presumably distally, away from the body, right?
Okay.
So you have, it's sort of the end of the hands. So it's smaller, presumably it's a smaller measurement than the palm. So the palm is this area, and the measurement of Rameir is this area. Okay. And the rabbis say it's a handful. Okay. Bishleim Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan's opinion of a handful is exactly the same as the rabbis. Huda Amar Krabanon. He says, like the rabbis, it's a handful, 2 hands, like this. Al Chizkiya, come on. Who is Chizkiya's opinion going like? Like Rameir. It's not like Rameir, because Rameir says this area, the upper part of it, from the base of the fingers until the end of the fingers, and Chizkiya says it's the palm. Like Rabbanon. Okay, so one answer is Amri Malay Pisiyad or Malay Kishas the Malachat Shiur. Some say it's the same amount, meaning the amount of rotted flesh could be fitted in the palm is the same as that can be fitted from the base of the fingers until the end of the finger. Amalei Rav Sim Barad Rav Papi Rav Papa Rav Sim Barad said to Rav Papa Mimai the Haimi Kisher Es V'Ois V'Lamal L'Raish Dom L'Mata Mididu the Havli Malay Pisiyad take Malay Pisiyad. So Rav Sim Barad says in the name of Rav Papa, perhaps the word Lamala upward doesn't mean distally away from the body; it means proximally toward the body. So actually, what it means from Ikra It's V'Oisav, the base of the fingers, Lamala meaning closer to the body, is the palm. It's effectively the same thing. Okay, and Taisus pulls out the last word of the Gemara, which is tekel. Okay. Tomorrow we continue with the sort of a graphic discussion about dead bodies and dead flesh. No.